The demand came on the wind, a whisper of steel and winter that coiled through the sun-drenched courtyards of Ethel. It was a promise of ruin delivered in the silken, unhurried script of a king who had seen empires turn to dust. King Thorn of the Umbral Court, the Shadow of the North, the vampire king whose name was a curse on the lips of children, demanded tribute. Not gold, not grain, not soldiers for his deathless armies. He demanded the jewel of Ethel. He demanded Princess Isolde. In the great hall, silence became a physical presence, a weight that pressed down on every gilded cornice and every trembling courtier. The air, thick with the scent of beeswax and wilting roses, grew thin and cold, as if the northern chill had followed the messenger's scroll. King Theron, his face the color of old parchment, stared at the elegant, cruel letters. His hands, usually so steady on the hilt of his ceremonial sword, shook with a fine, pathetic tremor. Isolde, his eldest, stood beside the throne, a perfect statue carved from moonlight and honey. Her beauty was the kingdom's pride, a living ballad sung by poets from the sea to the mountains. Her hair was spun gold, her eyes the color of a summer sky, her skin so luminous it seemed to mock the mortal flesh of others. She was, in every sense, the jewel. And now, she was to be payment for a peace that felt more like a prelude to extinction. A tear, perfect and crystalline, traced a path down her cheek. It was the only sign of her terror, a single flaw in her flawless composure. Further back, in the shadows cast by a great stone pillar, Princess Amora watched. She was the other one. The second daughter, the afterthought. Where Isolde was light, Amora was shade. Her hair was a dark, unruly river of brown, her eyes the color of moss and earth, her skin kissed by the sun from the hours she spent in the gardens, away from the stifling propriety of the court. She was not uncomely, but in the blinding presence of her sister, she was rendered invisible. She was the sensible one, the quiet one, the one with ink stains on her fingers and dirt under her nails. She was the lesser. And she loved her sister with a ferocity that was the one truly beautiful thing about her. She watched Isolde's perfect tear and felt a rage so pure it burned the air in her lungs. Isolde was made for love and laughter, for gentle hands and soft words. She was a hothouse flower, exquisitely beautiful and crushingly fragile. The north, with its jagged peaks of ice and its sunless king, would shatter her. The thought was not a thought at all, but a physical blow, a certainty that stole Amora's breath. She saw it all in a horrifying flash, Isolde's light extinguished, her laughter silenced, her beauty broken and discarded in the eternal twilight of Thorn's castle. No. It could not be. A decision, cold and sharp as a shard of glass, formed in the furnace of her love. It was an act of madness, an act of utter, hopeless defiance. But it was the only thing she could think to do. Her father was paralyzed by fear. Her mother was weeping into a lace handkerchief. The court was a gallery of wax figures, frozen in their own selfish terror. No one would save Isolde. So she would have to. A single, shuddering breath. That was all the warning Amora gave herself. She broke from the line of trembling courtiers, the rustle of her simple wool dress a desecration in the ringing silence. The marble floor was a shock of cold through her thin slippers as she fell to her knees before the obsidian throne where the vampire king's envoy stood, a creature as pale and still as the winter itself. She did not look at the envoy. She looked past him, as if she could see through his dead eyes to the monster who had sent him. She bowed her head, her dark hair spilling over her shoulders, and pressed her forehead to the frigid stone. The gesture was one of absolute submission, a groveling that sent a murmur of shame and shock through the assembled nobles. Her voice, when it came, was not a scream but a low, desperate prayer, raw and shaking but threaded with steel. "Take me instead." The words fell into the silence and shattered it. Her father gasped. Isolde made a small, wounded sound. The envoy, who had not so much as blinked through the entire proceeding, slowly lowered his gaze to the crumpled figure at his feet. Amora pushed herself up, just enough to meet his gaze. She had to make them understand. She had to sell this desperate, foolish bargain. "My sister, she is the jewel of our kingdom. She is precious. She is meant for the sun." Amora's hands clenched into fists on the floor. "I am not. I am strong. I am practical. I can work. I can serve. I will not break. Please. The last word was a whisper of pure agony. She will be of no use to your king. Her heart is too soft. But I will do whatever he asks. My life, my freedom, for hers. A tribute for a tribute. She was offering herself up like a lamb, a plain, brown lamb in place of the golden fleece. It was a pathetic offer. A ridiculous exchange. She knew it. But it was the only coin she possessed. The envoy's eyes, the color of a frozen lake, held hers for a long, unreadable moment. He saw not a princess, but a warrior kneeling in supplication. He saw the fire of sacrifice, a thing far rarer and more potent than simple beauty. He gave a nearly imperceptible nod, a gesture so slight it was more a feeling than a movement. Then he turned and left the great hall without another word, his cloak a whisper of shadow in his wake. Amora remained on her knees, the cold of the marble seeping into her bones, her heart hammering a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. She did not know if she had just saved her sister or condemned them both. She only knew that the silence that returned was different. It was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of a held breath, waiting for the fall of a northern axe. And she, the lesser sister, had just placed her own neck upon the block. The departure was a hurried, shameful affair. There was no grand procession, no tearful farewells from a grateful kingdom. There was only the grim finality of a carriage, black as a starless night, waiting in the pre-dawn gloom. Her father could not meet her eyes, his gaze fixed on some distant point of honor he had long since abandoned. His relief was a foul taste in the air, so palpable it was nearly a confession. He was losing a daughter, but he was keeping his jewel. Amora understood, with a clarity that felt like a physical wound, that he considered it a worthy trade. Isolde was the only one who wept. She clung to Amora's hands, her own soft and useless, her sky-blue eyes clouded with a storm of guilt and terror. "Don't go," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Amora, please. We'll think of something else. We'll run." Amora gently disentangled her fingers. She smoothed a stray golden curl from Isolde's forehead, her touch a strange mixture of fierce love and profound resignation. "There is nothing else," she said, her voice steady, a borrowed strength she did not feel. "You were meant to be a queen in the sun. I was meant, for this. To make sure you get there." She tried for a smile, but it was a brittle, fragile thing. "Be happy, Izzy. For both of us." She did not look back as she climbed into the carriage. To look back would be to see her sister's face, and that would break the iron wall she had built around her heart. The door closed with a heavy, final thud, sealing her in darkness. The interior was lined with black velvet that seemed to drink the meager light. It was unnervingly silent, the wheels making no sound on the cobblestones as they began to move. She was alone. Utterly, terrifyingly alone. The journey north was a slow erasure of the world she knew. The rolling green hills of Ethel flattened into stark, windswept plains. The sun, a familiar, friendly warmth, became a pale, distant disk in a sky the color of slate. The air grew thin and sharp, tasting of pine and ice. They traveled for 6 days, stopping only when the strange, silent driver brought her a tray of food she could not bring herself to eat. He never spoke. He never looked at her. He was less a man and more a function, an extension of the will of the king who had summoned her. On the 7th day, the mountains began to rise from the horizon, jagged teeth of black rock capped with eternal snow. They climbed into a land of shadow and echo, where the wind whispered through skeletal trees and waterfalls hung frozen in mid-air like captured ghosts. Amora pressed her face to the cold glass of the window, her breath misting the pain. This was his kingdom. A land of brutal, breathtaking beauty, as unforgiving and magnificent as the stories told of its master. The castle appeared as if by magic, not built upon a mountain but carved from its very heart. It was a fortress of obsidian and ice, a cluster of sharp, elegant spires that clawed at the perpetually overcast sky. It did not loom, it commanded. There was no sign of life, no guards on the battlements, no banners snapping in the wind. But Amora felt 1,000 unseen eyes upon her. The carriage passed through an archway of colossal, carved stone and into a silent, snow-dusted courtyard. The silence here was different from the silence of the court. It was not the absence of sound, it was the presence of something ancient and patient. The carriage door opened. The same silent driver offered a gloved hand. Amora ignored it, gathering her simple cloak around her and stepping out onto the ground. The cold was immediate, a living thing that bit at her skin and stole the air from her lungs. She looked up, at the impossible architecture, at the dark heart of her new prison. And then she saw him. He was standing at the top of a wide flight of stone steps, framed by the massive, iron-banded doors of the keep. He was not what she had expected. The tales spoke of a monster, a creature of nightmare and fang. The man before her was tall and unnervingly still, dressed in clothes as black as a raven's wing. His hair was the color of polished silver, a stark contrast to the youth of a face that was all sharp angles and severe, aristocratic beauty. But it was his eyes that held her. They were the color of twilight, a deep, fathomless violet, and they held the chilling weight of centuries. He was watching her, not with hunger or cruelty, but with a detached, academic curiosity, as if she were a curious new specimen he had acquired for his collection. This was King Thorn. Amora's heart, which had been a frantic bird in her chest for a week, suddenly went still. All the fear, all the panic, coalesced into a single, hard point of resolve. She had made her bargain. She would not disgrace it with trembling fear. She would not give him the satisfaction of a weeping, broken victim. She met his ancient gaze, lifted her chin, and began to walk up the steps, each footfall a small, defiant echo in the vast, waiting silence of his court. She was the substitute, the lesser prize. But she would not be nothing. Thorn watched her approach, a flicker of something akin to surprise in his ageless eyes. He had expected a cowering mouse, a tear-streaked girl dragged from the carriage. He had certainly not expected this. This quiet dignity. This defiance. He had agreed to the trade out of a moment's perverse curiosity. The girl's desperate courage had been a novel interruption in a century of predictable, groveling diplomacy. He had imagined she would be a more interesting, if less beautiful, plaything than her sister. A martyr, perhaps, whose pious suffering might provide a brief diversion. He had not expected her to meet his eyes. She stopped on the step below him, forcing him to look down, yet somehow the angle did not diminish her. She was close enough now that he could see the faint smattering of freckles across the bridge of her nose, a dusting of sun on a face that belonged in this land of eternal twilight. She smelled of winter air and something else, something green and alive. "Your Majesty," she said. Her voice was low and clear, without the quaver he had anticipated. She did not curtsy. She simply stood, a small, dark figure against the backdrop of his immense, silent castle, waiting. The silence stretched. Thorn let it, a tool he had honed over centuries to unnerve kings and break ambassadors. He used it now to measure her. He watched for the tremor in her hands, the flicker of fear in her earth-brown eyes, the instinct to bow her head in submission. None came. She simply waited, her gaze unwavering. It was intriguing. "You are not what I was promised," he said finally, his voice a low resonance that seemed to vibrate in the very stones beneath her feet. It was the first time she had heard him speak, a voice like crushed velvet and falling night. Amora's chin lifted another fraction of an inch. "No, Your Majesty. I am not. Your prize was too precious to be surrendered. I am the price that could be paid." There was no self-pity in her tone, only a statement of fact, as cold and hard as the mountain around them. A slow smile touched Thorn's lips, a subtle, dangerous curving of his mouth that did not reach his eyes. Ethel values its jewels, it seems, more than its iron. He turned, his black cloak swirling around him like smoke, and gestured toward the open doors. "Come. The price must be brought inside." The great hall was a cavern of shadow and starlight. The ceiling was a vault of black marble inlaid with what looked like actual constellations, glowing with a soft, silver light. There were no torches, no fires, only this cold, celestial luminescence. The air was still and frigid, carrying the scent of cold stone and old paper. It was beautiful, but it was the beauty of a tomb. He led her through echoing corridors and up spiraling staircases, his footsteps silent on the stone while hers seemed to cannonade through the oppressive quiet. He did not speak again, and Amora did not ask where they were going. She simply followed, her senses on high alert, cataloguing every detail of her gilded cage. She saw books bound in dark leather, tapestries depicting forgotten histories, windows that looked out not onto the world, but into deeper, darker parts of the mountain itself. Finally, he stopped before a pair of oak doors, intricately carved with vines and thorns. He pushed one open. "Your chambers." Amora stepped inside and her breath caught. It was not a cell. It was a suite of rooms larger than her entire wing of the palace back home. A fire, its flames a strange, cool blue, crackled in a hearth of polished black stone, casting flickering light over a bed draped in deep emerald velvet, a writing desk of dark wood, and shelves filled with yet more books. A balcony with a low, carved railing overlooked a breathtaking, terrifying vista of snow-capped peaks under a sky bruised with the colors of a perpetual sunset. "You will be comfortable here," Thorne stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You will be given anything you require. Food will be brought. Though I do not imagine you will have much of an appetite." The casual cruelty of the remark, a reminder of what he was and what he consumed, was delivered with the same detached calm as his tour. He expected her to be overwhelmed, perhaps even grateful for this luxurious prison. He expected tears of relief or a fresh wave of despair. Amora did neither. She walked past him to the shelves, her fingers trailing over the leather spines of the books. She pulled one out, its title embossed in silver. A Natural History of the Northern Flora. She turned back to him, the book held in her hands like a shield. "Thank you," she said, her voice even. "This will be more than adequate." Thorne felt that flicker of surprise again, stronger this time. He was the monster from the stories, the creature of the night. He had stolen her from her home and family, and she was thanking him for the quality of her cage's library. He studied her, the small, determined set of her jaw, the way she held the book as if it were an anchor in a storm. She was not playing a part. This quiet strength was genuine. "There are gardens," he found himself saying, the words leaving his lips before he had consciously formed them. "Or what passes for them in this climate. Through the western gallery. They have been neglected." Amora's eyes lit up with the first spark of genuine emotion he had seen in them, a sudden, fierce interest that was startling in its intensity. "Gardens?" "Of a sort," he clarified, almost annoyed at his own impulse to offer this information. "Mostly rock moss, shadow bloom, and plants that thrive in the cold. Nothing like the roses of Ethel." "Roses are beautiful, but they are useless," she replied, her voice sharpening with an unexpected passion. "They wilt at the first sign of hardship. I have always preferred the things that have to fight to grow." She had no idea that she had just described herself. Or perhaps she did. Thorne looked from her earnest, intelligent face to the book in her hands, and then back again. He had taken her as a curiosity, a substitute. He was beginning to suspect that the kingdom of Ethel, in its foolish, sentimental wisdom, had made a grave error in judgment. They had sent away their iron and kept their glass, thinking they had saved the thing of greater value. He inclined his head, a gesture that was almost a bow. "As you wish," he said, and retreated from the room, pulling the heavy door closed behind him. He left her standing in the silent, luxurious room, bathed in the cool blue light of the fire, a book on northern plants clutched in her hand. For the first time in over a century, Thorne, the King of Shadows, was not bored. He was intrigued. And that, he knew, was a far more dangerous thing. 3 weeks passed. They were measured not in sunrises, for the sun was a rumor here, but in the subtle shifting of the twilight that perpetually bathed the peaks. Amora settled into a routine that was both a survival mechanism and a quiet act of rebellion. She ate the food that was brought to her, simple meals of dark bread, sharp cheese, and smoked fish. She slept in the vast, velvet-draped bed, though her dreams were often a chaotic tapestry of her sister's golden hair and the vampire king's violet eyes. And she read. She consumed the library in her rooms with a ravenous hunger, learning the history of this strange, cold land, its myths, its people, its wars. She was a prisoner, yes, but she would not be an ignorant one. Thorne left her largely to her own devices. He seemed to be observing her from a distance, a silent, brooding presence at the edge of her awareness. She would catch glimpses of him in the echoing corridors, a flash of a silver hair or the swirl of a black cloak. He never approached, never spoke. It was a strange, unnerving courtesy. He had given her a cage, but he was allowing her the freedom to pace it. One day, driven by the memory of his words and a desperate need for something living, she sought out the western gallery. She found the gardens. He had not been lying. They were a sad, forgotten place, a series of stone terraces clinging to the mountainside, protected from the worst of the wind by high walls of dark rock. The soil was thin and choked with weeds. A few hardy, colorless mosses clung to the stones, and a scattering of stubborn, thorny plants with dark, waxy leaves pushed their way toward the bruised sky. It was a place of profound neglect. And Amora knew, with a sudden, bone-deep certainty, what she was going to do. She began the next morning. She found a small, rusted trowel and a pair of thick leather gloves in a forgotten potting shed. Her courtly hands, accustomed to embroidery needles and the smooth pages of books, were clumsy at first. The work was back-breaking. The soil was cold and dense, the weeds had roots like iron claws. Her muscles ached. Her fingers bled. But with every weed she pulled, with every patch of earth she cleared, she felt a piece of herself click back into place. This was who she was. Not a princess, not a jewel, but a gardener. A nurturer of stubborn, unloved things. She worked for days, losing herself in the rhythm of the labor. She was clearing a patch of earth near a crumbling stone bench when a shadow fell over her. She did not need to look up to know who it was. The air itself had grown colder, charged with his presence. "What are you doing?" Thorn's voice was a low murmur behind her. Amora did not stop her work. She dug her trowel into the resistant earth and levered out a thick, gnarled root. "Gardening," she said, her breath clouding in the frigid air. "This is not a garden. It is a graveyard for plants that have forgotten how to die." "Then I am reminding them how to live," she retorted, tossing the weed onto a growing pile. She finally sat back on her heels and looked up at him. His black-clad form was an intrusion of perfect, severe elegance in her world of dirt and stone. He was watching her hands, now caked with soil, a faint line between his silver brows. "Your hands will be ruined," he observed. "They're my hands. They're for doing things, not just for looking at." She gestured with the trowel to the cleared patch of earth. "The soil is poor, but it's not dead. It just needs care. There are dormant seeds here. Shadowbloom, he told me they were called. And frost thorn. They can grow, if they're given a chance." He was silent for a long moment, his violet eyes fixed on the small square of turned earth. It was a tiny victory against the overwhelming entropy of his castle, a small, defiant patch of order in a world of ancient neglect. He had lived for centuries, and it had never once occurred to him to pull a weed. He had power over nations, over life and death, but this small, grubby woman kneeling in the dirt was exercising a power he did not comprehend, the power to create. "Why?" he asked, the question seeming to be pulled from him against his will. "Why do this?" Amora looked at him, and for the first time, she did not see a monster or a king. She saw something else, something ancient and achingly lonely. She saw a man presiding over a kingdom of beautiful, dead things. "Because it is better to build something than to break it," she said softly. "And because everything, even here, deserves a chance to grow." That was the first crack in the wall between them. It was not a grand speech or a dramatic confrontation, but a quiet moment in a dying garden. He did not offer to help. He did not praise her. He simply watched her for another minute, a strange, contemplative look on his face, and then he turned and walked away, leaving her alone with the dirt and the stubborn, sleeping seeds. The next morning, when she went to the garden, a set of new tools was lying on the stone bench, a spade with a polished ash handle, a sturdy iron fork, and gloves made of soft, supple leather that fit her hands perfectly. There was no note. There was no explanation. There was only the silent, startling acknowledgement. He was watching. And he was, in his own way, listening. The library became their neutral ground. It was a vast, circular room, 2 stories high, with shelves that groaned under the weight of millennia. The air smelled of vellum, leather, and dust, a scent Amora found more comforting than any perfume. She spent most of her time there, and it was there he began to seek her out. He would appear without a sound, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows between the shelves, and find her curled in a worn leather armchair, a heavy tome open in her lap. At first, their conversations were stilted, cautious explorations. He would ask what she was reading. She would ask him about a passage she did not understand, a reference to a forgotten battle or a dynasty that had crumbled to dust 1,000 years before she was born. He was a living library, a repository of history she could not have imagined. He spoke of the founding of Ethel as if he had been there, describing the color of the first king's banner and the way the sun had glinted off his armor. He spoke of politics and philosophy, of art and war, with the weary, encyclopedic knowledge of one who had seen it all, time and time again. Amora, in turn, was a surprise to him. She did not ask him the questions he was used to, questions born of fear or morbid curiosity about his nature. She did not ask how many he had killed or what it was like to drink blood. Instead, she asked him why. Why had he allied with the Sunstone Empire in the Third Age? Why had he commissioned the northern frescoes from a disgraced Florentine artist? She engaged with his mind, not his monstrosity. One evening, she found a book on celestial cartography. The star charts were complex and beautiful. The ceiling in the great hall, she said, not looking up from the page as he materialized near her chair. It's not just decoration, is it? It's a real map of the heavens. It is, he confirmed, his voice a low rumble. As they were, 10,000 years ago. The constellations shift, over time. Why that specific night? She asked, tracing a silver spiral with her finger. He was silent for so long she thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, stripped of its usual ironic distance. It was the night I was made. Amora looked up at him. The cool, magical light of the library's enchanted globes softened the sharp planes of his face, making him look younger, more vulnerable. She saw not the vampire king, but the man he had been, 10,000 years ago, on the night his world had ended and begun again. I'm sorry, she whispered, the words inadequate but heartfelt. Thorn gave a short, mirthless laugh. Do not be. Pity is a useless emotion. He walked to one of the high-arched windows that looked out into the mountain's dark heart. I was a scholar. A prince of a kingdom whose name is no longer even a memory. I sought knowledge above all else. I made a bargain for eternal life, believing it would grant me eternal time to learn. And did it? Amora asked gently. He turned from the window, his violet eyes seeming to absorb all the light in the room. It gave me eternal time, he said, his voice flat. But I had forgotten that knowledge is meaningless without connection. It is just data. A collection of facts in a cold, empty room. I have read every book in this library 100 times. I have seen civilizations rise and fall like the tide. And I have been utterly, profoundly alone through all of it. It was a confession of such staggering loneliness that it left Amora breathless. She saw him then, truly saw him for the first time, a prisoner just as surely as she was, but his cage was infinitely larger, built of time itself. He had taken her to assuage his boredom, but what he truly craved was not a distraction, but a witness. Someone to see him, the man buried beneath the monster and the king. She closed the book and set it carefully aside. Tell me, she said, her voice soft but firm. Tell me the name of your kingdom. He looked at her, and for a fleeting, impossible moment, the ancient weariness in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of something like hope. And so he did. He spoke a word in a language long dead, a name that tasted of sunlight and sea salt and a life he could barely remember. And Amora listened, and in that vast, silent library, surrounded by the ghosts of 10,000 years, a fragile, impossible bridge was built between them, spun from the shared thread of their solitude. Amora began to see the other side of him, the king beneath the captor. She had asked for access to the castle's archives, a request he had granted with a raised eyebrow and a flicker of amusement. She spent her days there, amidst the dry, dusty scent of aging paper, piecing together the true history of the umbral court. It was not the blood-soaked chronicle of horror she had been taught to expect. There were treaties, trade agreements, and letters of state. There were records of famine relief sent to struggling mountain villages, judicial rulings that showed a surprising degree of fairness, and architectural plans for aqueducts and granaries. He was not just a predator, he was a ruler. A steward of his cold, hard land and its pale, quiet people. One afternoon, she was returning from the archives when she heard voices coming from a chamber off the main hall. The doors were slightly ajar. Curiosity, a trait she had in abundance, compelled her to stop and listen. Inside, Thorn was holding court. It was not a grand affair like her father's, filled with pomp and flattery. There were only two others present, gaunt-faced men with the hard, weathered look of the northern mountain clans. They stood before him, their heads bowed not in terror, but in respect. "The ice flows have shifted early, my king," one of the men was saying, his voice rough. "It has cut off the eastern pass. The village of Greyfell will be without supplies before the next moon." Thorn stood before a massive map carved into the surface of a stone table. He leaned over it, his silver hair falling forward, tracing a line with a single, elegant finger. "The old tunnels beneath the Dragon's Tooth," he said, his voice devoid of emotion but sharp with authority. "They are treacherous, but they will be passable. I will have a contingent of my guard guide your supply train. They will leave at dusk." "But the beasts, your majesty," the other man protested. "The tunnels have not been cleared in a generation. The snowghasts." Thorn looked up, and the full weight of his ancient power filled the room. His violet eyes seemed to glow in the dim light. "The snowghasts will not be a problem," he said, his tone leaving no doubt that he spoke the absolute truth. He straightened up, his gaze distant. "Greyfell sent their sons to defend this castle during the Wild Hunt uprising. That is a debt that is not forgotten. See to it that their people do not go hungry." The men bowed deeply, a gesture of genuine gratitude, and backed out of the room. Amora pressed herself into the shadows of the hallway as they passed, her heart pounding. She had just witnessed an act of governance, of responsible kingship. He was a monster, yes. He had taken her, and his nature was a thing of darkness. But he was not a tyrant. He was a protector of his people. He remembered debts from generations past and honored them. Her father, for all his posturing about honor, had traded his own daughter for peace. The contrast was a stark, uncomfortable revelation. The world she had built in her mind, a simple world of good and evil, of light and darkness, was beginning to crumble. He was a creature of shadow, but he ruled with a strange, enduring form of light. He was her captor, but he treated her with a respect her own family never had. He was a killer, but he was also a preserver. The contradictions of him were a labyrinth, and she was getting lost inside it. Later that evening, he found her in the library, staring into the cool blue flames of the fire. "You were listening earlier," he stated. It was not a question. Amora did not deny it. She turned from the hearth to face him. "You are a better king than my father," she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. A look of genuine surprise crossed his features. "He is a king of men. He rules a land of sun and plenty. I rule a kingdom of rock and shadow. We are not comparable." "He would have let the village starve," Amora said, her voice low and fierce. "He would have spoken of the cost, of the danger to the soldiers. He would have found a dozen reasons why it was impractical to help. He would have let them die and called it prudent governance." She shook her head, a deep, bitter anger rising in her. "You call it a debt. He would have called it a poor investment." Thorn regarded her, his head tilted. "You are not fond of your father." "I am fond of my sister," she corrected him. My father is a king who polishes his crown but forgets his people. He cares for the appearance of strength, not the act of it. He would sacrifice anyone, anything, to protect his own comfort." The unspoken accusation hung in the air between them. "He sacrificed me." Thorn closed the distance between them in 2 silent strides. He stood before her, so close she could see the intricate, alien patterns of silver in his violet irises. He did not touch her, but his proximity was a physical force, a gravity that held her in place. "And you," he said, his voice a soft, dangerous whisper. "You would sacrifice yourself to protect someone you love." He saw the flicker of pain in her eyes and knew he had struck a nerve. "It is a rare quality. In my experience, a foolish one. Self-preservation is the engine of the world." "Perhaps," Amora countered, her chin held high, "the world would be a better place if it had a different engine. Their eyes held for a long, charged moment. The air crackled with unspoken things, with the terrifying, thrilling pull of two opposing forces finding an unexpected point of balance. He was an immortal predator, a creature of ultimate self-preservation. She was a mortal woman, defined by her capacity for self-sacrifice. They should have been enemies. They should have been a simple story of a monster and his victim. But here, in the heart of his dark castle, they were becoming something else entirely. Something far more complex, and infinitely more dangerous for them both. He saw in her a strength he had never known, and she saw in him a humanity he had long forgotten. And in that shared recognition, the last of her fear began to transform into something that felt frighteningly like hope. A storm broke over the mountains that night, a howling fury of wind and snow that threw itself against the castle walls. The wind shrieked through the crenellations like a tormented spirit, and the entire fortress seemed to groan under the assault. Amora lay in her bed, listening to the storm's rage, feeling a strange kinship with its wild, untamed power. Sleep would not come. The conversation with Thorn had unsettled her, leaving her thoughts in a turbulent, chaotic whirl. A crash of thunder, so loud it shook the stone floors, was followed by a sudden, plunging darkness. The magical blue flames in her hearth sputtered and died. The enchanted lights in the corridors went out. For the first time since her arrival, the castle was plunged into absolute, pitch-black silence, the only sound the screaming of the wind outside. A primal, childish fear, one she hadn't felt in years, seized her. It was an irrational terror of the dark, of the things that might lurk within it. She sat bolt upright in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs, her breath catching in her throat. She was alone, in the dark, in a vampire's castle, in the heart of a raging storm. She heard a sound from the hallway, a faint, scratching noise, followed by a low, guttural growl. It was not human. It was not Thorn. It was something else. Something that had been awakened by the storm and the failure of the castle's ancient wards. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She scrambled out of bed, her bare feet hitting the frigid stone floor. She fumbled her way toward the door, her hands outstretched in the suffocating darkness, intending to bar it. But before she could reach it, the door creaked open. A shape stood silhouetted against the slightly less absolute black of the hallway. It was tall, impossibly thin, with arms that hung too long at its sides and a head that lolled at an unnatural angle. A low, wet snarl echoed in the room. A snowghast. One of the creatures from the tunnels. The storm must have driven it up from the mountain's depths. Amora froze, every muscle in her body screaming. This was it. This was the monster from the stories. Not the beautiful, complicated king, but a mindless, hungry thing of tooth and claw. She backed away, her hands finding the cold, hard surface of the writing desk. Her fingers closed around something heavy, a crystal inkwell. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was all she had. The creature took a shuffling step into the room, its head twisting as it sniffed the air, its unseen eyes fixing on her. It let out another low growl, a sound of pure, predatory hunger. And then, another shadow moved in the doorway, a darker black against the black. Get away from her. Thorn's voice. It was not the cultured, resonant voice he used with her. This was a sound stripped of all humanity, a command as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. It was the voice of a predator chiding a lesser beast for touching its kill. The ghast hesitated, letting out a questioning hiss. In the next instant, Thorn moved. He was not a man walking, he was a blur of motion, a current of violence that flowed through the darkness. There was a sickening, wet crunch, a brief, high-pitched squeal of pain, and then a heavy thud as the creature's body hit the floor. Silence returned, absolute and profound, broken only by Amora's ragged breathing and the howl of the wind. A moment later, a blue flame, small and flickering, appeared in Thorn's cupped hand. He had conjured it from nothing, a tiny, personal star in the oppressive dark. In its eerie light, she saw the ghast lying dead on the floor, its neck twisted at an impossible angle. Thorn stood over it, his face a mask of cold fury. There was not a speck of blood on him. He turned his gaze to her, and his expression softened almost imperceptibly as he took in her state. She was backed against the desk, clutching the inkwell like a dagger, her eyes wide with terror, her nightgown a pale splash of white in the gloom. He took a step toward her, and she flinched. He stopped immediately, the magical flame in his hand casting long, dancing shadows on his face. "I am not going to harm you," he said, his voice regaining its familiar, controlled cadence. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "A pest," he said with dismissive contempt. "The storm sometimes disturbs them. The castle's wards should have kept it out. They must be failing." He looked at her again, at the way she was shivering, and a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. He walked not to her, but to the large, carved chest at the foot of her bed. He opened it and pulled out a heavy cloak, one lined with dark fur. He walked back to her, moving slowly, deliberately, as if approaching a frightened animal. He did not speak. He simply held the cloak out. After a moment's hesitation, Amora dropped the inkwell, the crystal making a sharp clatter on the floor. She allowed him to drape the heavy garment over her shoulders. The fur was incredibly soft, and it held a residual warmth that seemed to seep directly into her chilled skin. It smelled faintly of him, of cold stone, old books, and something else, something uniquely his, a scent of winter night and ancient power. He drew the edges of the cloak together in front of her, his fingers brushing against her collarbone. The touch was feather-light, almost accidental, but it sent a jolt through her entire body, a shock of warmth that had nothing to do with the fur. His hands were impossibly cold, the touch of a marble statue, but the feeling it ignited in her was anything but. She looked up into his face, illuminated by the small, magical flame he still held. His violet eyes were fixed on hers, and in their depths, she saw a maelstrom of emotions she could not name. Possession, protection, and something else, something deeper and more terrifyingly tender. He had killed the monster. He had brought her light in the darkness. He had wrapped her in his own warmth. He was her captor. He was her protector. The line between the two had just been irrevocably, terrifyingly erased. He did not move away. He stood before her, his hands still resting on the collar of the cloak, their faces inches apart. The storm raged outside, and the dead creature lay on the floor, but in this small circle of blue light, the world had shrunk to the space between them. The silence was no longer empty, it was filled with the frantic beating of her heart and the weight of 1,000 unspoken, impossible things. He had claimed her with this single, simple gesture of care, and she, trembling in the protective darkness of his cloak, had let him. The storm passed, and with it, the immediate sense of crisis. The castle's magical lights returned, the halls fell silent once more, and the body of the snowghast vanished as if it had never been. But the intimacy of that moment in the darkness lingered, a tangible presence that altered the very air between them. Thorn became a more constant fixture, no longer a fleeting shadow but a steady presence. He would join her in the gardens, watching in silence as she coaxed green shoots from the cold earth. He would sit with her in the library, not always talking, but simply sharing the space, the quiet companionship, a new and fragile language they were both learning. Amora found herself forgetting, for long stretches of time, that she was a prisoner. The fear that had been her constant companion for weeks had been replaced by a complex, bewildering array of new emotions. She felt a deep, resonant connection to his ancient loneliness, a startling admiration for his stern sense of duty, and a terrifying, undeniable attraction to the man himself. She saw the moments of vulnerability he let no one else see, the weary line of his shoulders as he studied his maps, the faint, sad smile that touched his lips when she described the raucous, chaotic warmth of her sister's last birthday party. One morning, a month after the storm, one of Thorn's silent, pale-faced servants delivered a small, sealed packet to her rooms. It was a letter. The wax seal was the crest of Ethel. Her heart leaped into her throat. It was from Isolde. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. The letter was short, the usually perfect script blotched in places, as if with tears. "Dearest Amora, I hope this finds you well. I pray for you every day. Father says the arrangement is for the best, that the kingdom is safe because of you. He says you are being treated as a guest of honor. I hope he is right. It is so quiet here without you. The gardens are overgrown. No one knows how to care for them properly. I miss your scolding and your laughter. I miss you. Please be safe. Please know that I love you. Your sister, Isolde. Amora read the letter 3 times, a wave of homesickness and love so powerful it made her ache. She could picture Isolde perfectly, sitting at her delicate writing desk, a single perfect tear falling onto the page. She missed her. She missed the sun, the scent of her mother's roses, the familiar, comforting weight of her old life. She was standing on her balcony, the letter clutched in her hand, staring out at the jagged peaks when Thorn found her. The wind whipped a strand of her dark hair across her face, and she didn't bother to brush it away. "News from home?" he asked. He did not need to see the letter to know. Her entire posture radiated a sorrow that was a foreign country in his castle. Amora nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. "You miss them," he stated. It was not a question. A shadow passed over his face, a shuttering of his features that made him look once again like the cold, remote king she had first met. "She is my sister," Amora said softly. "Of course I miss her. And you regret your choice," he continued, his voice flat, devoid of its usual resonance. "You wish you were back in your sun-drenched kingdom, arranging flowers and planning for a suitable marriage to some dull-witted princeling." The accusation in his tone, the sudden, bitter cruelty of it, was like a slap. Amora spun to face him, her eyes flashing. "You think this is about regret?" she demanded, her voice shaking with anger. "You think after everything, I wish I had let them send her here? To you? To be your plaything? To be terrified and alone until you grew bored of her? I would make the choice again, 1,000 times over, to spare her that." "And what of you?" he pressed, taking a step closer, his form blocking out the pale light. "Are you not terrified and alone?" "I am not Isolde," she cried, the words torn from her. "I am not made of glass. I am not afraid of the dark. And I am not alone." The final words hung in the air, a confession she had not meant to make. The anger drained out of her as quickly as it had come, replaced by a horrified realization of what she had just admitted. She looked at him, her heart pounding, and saw that his face was a storm of conflicting emotions. The cold mask was gone, replaced by a raw, naked vulnerability that mirrored her own. He thought she wanted to leave. He believed that, given the chance, she would flee back to her old life without a second thought. He saw her love for her sister as a rejection of him, of this strange, fragile world they had built together. He was immortal, powerful, a king of shadows, and in that moment, he looked as terrified of being abandoned as any mortal man. "Amora," he began, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't decipher. But she didn't let him finish. She couldn't bear the chasm that had opened between them. Before she could think, before she could lose her nerve, she closed the distance between them, rose up on her toes, and pressed her lips to his. It was a kiss born of desperation and a fierce, defiant tenderness. His lips were cold as marble, but the shock of it was electric. For a moment, he was utterly still, frozen in surprise. Then, with a low sound deep in his chest, a groan that was equal parts agony and relief, he responded. His arms came around her, pulling her tight against him, and his mouth softened against hers. The kiss deepened, changing from a desperate plea to a conversation, a discovery. It was not the kiss of a monster claiming his victim. It was a kiss of devastating, heartbreaking equality. A meeting of two solitudes, a collision of shadow and a stubborn, earthy light. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. Amora rested her forehead against his chest, the cold of his body a strange comfort. He stroked her hair, his touch infinitely gentle. The letter from Isolde was still crumpled in her hand, a fragile link to a life that no longer felt like her own. She had come here to save her sister, but somewhere in the darkness, in the silence, in the shared intimacy of a dying garden and a forgotten library, she had accidentally, impossibly, saved herself. And in doing so, she had found something she had never known she was looking for. The arrival of the royal delegation from Ethel was unannounced. They came in a gilded carriage that looked garish and foolish against the stark black rock of Thorn's domain, their bright silks and polished armor an affront to the monochromatic landscape. Amora saw them from the library window, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She knew, with a sick certainty, why they were here. Thorn was summoned, and he requested her presence in the great hall. She walked at his side, not behind him, a small but significant shift in their dynamic that was not lost on the pale, silent servants who watched them pass. She had shed her simple wool dress for one of deep emerald velvet that he had gifted her, a color that brought out the green in her moss-colored eyes. She wore no jewels, save for the fierce, protective set of her jaw. They entered the hall to find her father, King Theron, standing in the center of the vast, starlit chamber. He was flanked by his guards, and standing slightly behind him, looking small and terrified, was Isolde. Her golden hair was a beacon of sunlight in the gloom, her sky-blue dress a painful reminder of the world Amora had left behind. King Theron puffed out his chest, attempting a posture of regal authority that looked merely pompous in the intimidating grandeur of Thorn's hall. "King Thorn," he began, his voice attempting a boom that only resulted in a weak echo. "I have come to correct a grave error." Thorn did not move. He stood beside his throne, a silent, obsidian pillar of a man, his violet eyes fixed on the visiting king. He did not invite them to be seated. He did not offer any pleasantries. He simply waited. Emboldened by the silence, her father continued, his words slick with a practiced, political charm. "A misunderstanding. My youngest, in a fit of overwrought, sisterly affection, offered herself in place of her elder. A noble, if foolish, gesture. But the tribute demanded was the jewel of Ethel. My daughter, Isolde." He gestured grandly toward the golden princess, who flinched at the attention. "I have brought her to you now, to fulfill our agreement. The true tribute. You may return the substitute. There will be no harm done, no slight perceived. We shall consider the matter closed." He smiled, a smug, self-satisfied expression. He believed he was being magnanimous. He was offering Thorn the prize he had originally wanted, condescending to take back the lesser goods. He spoke of Amora as if she were a faulty piece of merchandise, a thing to be exchanged. Amora felt a humiliation so profound it threatened to suffocate her. She could feel the eyes of her father's guards on her, could feel Isolde's pitying gaze. In this moment, she was once again the shadow, the afterthought, the price that could be paid and, apparently, refunded. She stared at the floor, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, waiting for Thorn's inevitable agreement. Of course he would agree. Why would he keep the plain, brown sparrow when the golden songbird was finally in his grasp? He had gotten what he wanted from her, a cure for his boredom. Now the real prize was here. She braced herself for the dismissal, for the cold words that would send her back to a home that had never truly felt like one, to a life of invisibility and quiet desperation. And then, Thorn laughed. It was not a loud sound. It was a low, dark chuckle that seemed to come from the very depths of the mountain. It was a sound of pure, incredulous amusement, and it cut through her father's smug pronouncements like a scythe. King Theron's smile faltered. "Your Majesty." Thorn moved. He stepped down from the dais and walked to where Amora stood, frozen in her misery. He reached out and, taking the heavy, fur-lined cloak from the back of his throne, he draped it around her shoulders. It was the same cloak from the night of the storm, the same gesture of possession and protection. He drew it closed, his fingers brushing her throat, and then he left his hand resting on her shoulder, a firm, proprietary weight. He turned to face her father, his eyes no longer amused, but blazing with a cold, terrifying fire. "You come into my home," Thorn said, his voice a silken, deadly whisper that carried to every corner of the hall. "You stand on my stone. And you offer me this." He flicked his gaze contemptuously toward the trembling Isolde, who looked as though she might shatter. "You offer me glass," he said, his voice dropping even lower, yet gaining in intensity, "when I already hold the diamond." The words struck the hall with the force of a physical blow. Amora's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. Her father stared, his mouth agape, comprehension dawning on his face with agonizing slowness. Isolde gasped, a small, wounded sound. Thorn's gaze softened as he looked down at Amora. He saw the shock in her eyes, the dawning, fragile hope. He had seen her strength, her fire, her intelligence. He had seen her create life in a dead garden and stand fearlessly in the face of his darkness. She was not a substitute. She was a revelation. He turned his burning gaze back to King Theron. "Your jewel is beautiful, But she is brittle. She would have broken in a week. This one, he said, his hand tightening almost imperceptibly on Amora's shoulder, this one has a spine of iron and a heart of fire. She is not a prize to be displayed. She is a queen to rule at my side. He reached up and his fingers gently touched Amora's cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. You made your choice, King of Ethel. You chose your pretty, shining ornament. You discarded the treasure. A foolish bargain. One you will now live with. He looked past her father, his voice rising to a regal command that brooked no argument. Leave. Now. And never return. The alliance between our kingdoms is severed. But know this, Ethel is safe from all its enemies, because it is under her protection. An attack on them is an attack on my queen. And I do not suffer attacks on what is mine. He had not just refused the exchange. He had not just claimed her. He had crowned her. He had declared her his queen in front of the very people who had always seen her as less. He had given her not just his protection, but his power. King Theron, his face a mottled canvas of fury and fear, finally understood. He had not come to correct a mistake, he had come to reveal the depth of his own catastrophic misjudgment. Without another word, he turned, grabbing a stunned Isolde by the arm, and all but fled the hall, his guards scrambling after him. The great doors boomed shut, leaving Amora and Thorn alone in the vast, silent chamber. The starlight from the enchanted ceiling seemed to shine down on her, bathing her in a silver luminescence. She was trembling, not from fear, but from the overwhelming, earth-shattering force of being seen. Truly, finally seen, for everything she was. She looked up at Thorn, her heart in her eyes. The fire was gone from his gaze, replaced by that achingly tender expression she was coming to know. You never wanted the jewel, she whispered, the realization dawning. No, he said, his voice soft. I never wanted the jewel. I wanted the fire. I just didn't know it until it was kneeling at my feet, offering to burn for someone else. He smiled, a true, genuine smile that transformed his severe face into something devastatingly beautiful. It seems, my dear Amora, that in your attempt to save your sister, you accidentally conquered a kingdom. The great hall was silent after their departure, the echoes of her father's folly fading into the vast, ancient quiet of the castle. The weight of Thorn's cloak was a comfort around Amora's shoulders, a tangible symbol of the reality that was still struggling to take root in her mind. A queen. He had called her his queen. He had offered her not a gilded cage, but a shared throne. She turned to face him, her moss-green eyes searching his violet ones. The power and fury he had displayed to her father had receded, replaced by a quiet intensity, a focus that was entirely on her. Why, she asked, the single word encompassing 1,000 questions. Why choose her? Why defend her? Why elevate her? Because for the first time in 500 years, my world is no longer in grayscale, he answered, his voice a low, intimate murmur meant only for her. You arrived, covered in the dust of the road and the grime of sacrifice, and you brought color with you. You brought purpose. You walked into my perfectly preserved, lifeless world and you began to pull weeds. He reached out, his cool fingers tracing the line of her jaw. I have been surrounded by sycophants and enemies for centuries. I have known fear, and I have known obedience. But I had forgotten what it was to be challenged. To be surprised. To be, intrigued. His thumb brushed across her lower lip, a touch that was both possessive and reverent. You did not just accept your fate. You wrestled with it. You tended my dead gardens, you organized my forgotten archives, you faced down my nightmares. You looked upon a monster and did not flinch, but instead asked him the name of the home he'd lost. His hand fell to her shoulder, his grip gentle but firm. Isolde is the sun. She is beautiful and bright, and all of Ethel revolves around her. But the sun burns out. It is predictable. You, he said, his eyes holding hers with captivating force, are the earth. You are stubborn and patient and strong. You do not burn, you endure. You create life where none should exist. What fool would choose a fleeting, fiery star when he could have the world itself? Tears welled in Amora's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of overwhelming, cathartic release. Every moment of her life she had been the lesser, the shadow. Her own father had seen her as disposable. But this ancient, powerful, magnificent creature saw her as the world. "I am not a queen," she whispered, the words thick with emotion. "I don't know how to be." "I have not had a queen for 3,000 years, he replied, a faint, wry smile on his lips. "I am out of practice myself." "We will learn together." He led her toward the throne, a massive thing of carved obsidian that had always seemed so intimidating. Now, it just looked like a chair. He did not sit, but stood before it, turning her to face him. "This is not a prison, Amora," he said, his voice earnest. "Not anymore. It is your home, if you will have it. Your kingdom, if you will help me rule it. I am offering you not just my name, or my protection. I am offering you my eternity. All of my vast, empty years. Fill them. Argue with me. Read with me. Plant your stubborn flowers in my snow. Be the fire in the heart of my winter. Be my queen." It was the furthest thing from a demand. It was a plea, the most profound and vulnerable request she had ever heard. The vampire king, the shadow of the north, was asking. Not taking. She thought of her life in Ethel, a life of being overlooked, of shrinking herself to make room for her sister's light. She thought of the future she would have faced, a quiet, loveless political marriage, a life of silent, dutiful obsolescence. And then she looked at the man before her, who had seen past the plain facade to the iron core of her, who called her a diamond when her own family had seen her as glass. She raised a hand, her fingers no longer caked with dirt but still practical, still strong, and laid it against his chest. She could not feel a heartbeat, but she could feel him, the steady, ancient presence of him. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong, a sound of absolute certainty in the quiet hall. A look of profound relief washed over his features, smoothing away the last lines of ancient weariness. He leaned down and kissed her, not with the desperate discovery of their first kiss, but with the deep, resonant promise of 1,000 more to come. It was a kiss of beginnings, of treaties signed and futures forged. When he drew back, he took her hand and led her up the steps of the dais. Together, they stood before the obsidian throne, looking out over the vast, empty hall. It did not feel empty anymore. It felt like it was filled with possibility. "Our kingdom," he said softly, his arm sliding around her waist, pulling her against his side. Amora leaned her head against his shoulder, breathing in his scent of winter and old books. She looked out at the constellations glowing on the ceiling, the map of the sky from the night his eternity had begun. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this was the night her own had truly started. Not as a substitute, not as a sacrifice, but as a ruler, a partner, and the cherished, beloved heart of the shadow